We're really very excited to have with us this evening the host and voice of NPR's Weekend Edition Saturday, Scott Simon. I don't know why I always feel inadequate with my voice introducing somebody like Scott. Scott is, of course, one of America's best-known broadcasters and has won every major award in broadcasting. In addition to his longtime role at NPR, he's a special contributor to CBS Sunday Morning. In fact, a couple of weeks ago or so, you may have seen on that program a special video essay that drew on Scott's new book, My Cubs, A Love Story. Scott has written more than half a dozen previous works. A couple were novels. Of the nonfiction books, one was about adoption and another about his unforgettable mother. He spoke about that on that book here last couple years ago. Two involve sports and were about Jackie Robinson and Scott's own life as an avid fan. His latest book also derives from sports, as you could tell from the title, specifically Scott's lifelong devotion to the Chicago Cubs. In fact, as Scott notes, he used to list among his hobbies, quote, bleeding for the Chicago Cubs. Now, his bleeding and the long-suffering loyalty and patience of so many other fans, as we all know, ended up rewarded last November when the Cubs won the World Series. Now, Scott has some pretty good bona fides as a Cubs fan. For one, Charlie Grimm, who managed the Cubs the last time they were in the World Series in 1945, was an uncle of Scott's of sorts. And he was married to a close friend of the mother. And right, that's right. And Jack Brickhouse, who served as Cubs announcer for more than 30 years, was Scott's godfather and his dad's best friend. And of course, as we all can attest, Scott knows how both to tell a story and to analyze a situation. His book is filled not only with personal accounts growing up in Chicago, rooting for the Cubs, but also with reflections on how the team has shaped Chicago and the lives of so many Chicagoans. Compact, lucid, and immensely entertaining, the book can be read in just a sitting or two, but its lessons, but you might want to stay longer and savor over it. Okay. I heard him gasp here for a minute. But the book's lessons will stay with you a lifetime. Scott writes that he's suspicious about drawing lessons from the love of a sports team. Quote, but loving the Cubs, he says in a sentence near the end of the book that's highlighted on the back cover, so I'm not giving anything away. But loving the Cubs has taught a lot of us, not just Cubs fans, that life is more about trying than winning, and trying again and then again. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Scott Simon.
That's a beautiful introduction from someone who I happen to notice has a San Francisco Giants World Series champion banner hanging up in his office. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see everyone here, and I know that there are a lot of other things you could be doing in the Washington D.C. area on a Wednesday night. Particularly on this Wednesday night, you could be home watching Anderson Cooper. I was just exchanging words with a particularly distinguished member of Congress who's here, who I'm not going to embarrass, and said, shouldn't you be busy tonight? And he said he was looking for a little distraction in the story of the Cubs, like the Red Sox. I was going to introduce my family. My wife Caroline is here in the first row. It's quite impossible to introduce the rest of my family, though, because they've disappeared to go downstairs, right, and to read books and to perhaps get the odd beverage. So, in any event,
Actually, we're right here.
oh, there. Oh, all right. Our daughters, Elise on the right, Paulina on the left. And isn't that an absolutely beautiful sweatshirt that Elise is wearing? We were at the home opener in Wrigley Field the other night, and I had actually ostensibly packed for our daughters and hadn't prepared for the cold. So naturally, we had to buy an article of clothing or two to be able to outfit ourselves against the frigid temperatures. and they had a lot of. They were by the time I clawed. It was really a fierce crowd, wasn't it, baby? By the time I got up there, they were out of a lot of sizes, and I like the way this kind of looks like. Could you put the hood up for a moment? Yeah, watch this. Isn't that wonderful? I think she looks. She more. I think she looks a little bit like a Benedictine monk too when she wears that. So glad that they're here. Let me begin, if I can, by reading a section that I hope remind you of something. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by the madness of being a Cubs fan. Starving for victory, hysterical, naked in cold lake winds, dragging ourselves through north side streets at dawn looking for the fix of one lousy run. Angel-headed losers burning for the ancient ivied connection to the starry dynamo phenom that only the Yankees ever seem to sign. I was trying to pipe a little bit of Ginsberg there. The book is called My Cubs: A Love Story. I wanted to call it The Greatest Story Ever Told. But then my publisher said this might be widely misunderstood when it came out, obviously, during the Easter and Passover season. But it is a love story, particularly with both of my parents and being gone now. It is the longest standing love relationship of my life. I have an old friend from high school here today, Al Lichtenstein. I mean, the Cubs were woven into our everyday lives during baseball season. I'm going to read a section in a while. The relationship, I think, between the neighborhood and the club is something that you only see duplicated, of course, in Boston and Fenway Park, and before that, certainly in Brooklyn and neighborhood of Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Dodgers. But, with all due respect to San Francisco and other great ballparks that they've built in the past few years, those places are all trying to imitate Wrigley Field. But because some of them even have ivy, some of them even have, a lot of them have red brick facades. What they don't have is a real neighborhood surrounding it. And that's what you find utterly distinct in the story of the Cubs and the relationship with the north side of Chicago. When I was at my grammar school at the corner of Pine Grove and Grace, when we were at Senn High School in like Mr. Corliss's classroom on the third floor and Miss Lindahl's classroom on the third floor, in April or in September, when the windows were open, you could hear the occasional cheer from Wrigley Field. And I do mean occasional cheer, because there weren't a lot in those days. And when we were at the home opener the other night, I'm afraid I forced my family to make a reverse of the ride on the L I would take home every day to come home from high school, where we passed the Addison Street station. Now, Al, you would have gone west, taken the 155 west on Devon, I would imagine, to go home. 8 or 4 John Peterson. Okay, I beg your pardon. This is Chicago stuff. Some of us, Billy Levitt, Sammy Schwartz, and myself, we would take the L, and we would. I'm going to read a section because I'm afraid I forced my family to do that the other night as we were going to the ballpark. But I think it says something about the relationship between the team and the city and the history that's quite extraordinary. We'd ride south past Belmont, Wellington, Diversey, Fullerton, and Armitage, where the L trains threaded down into the subway tunnels toward Clark and Division. I'd try to take looks into the open windows of the second floors of the North Side territory, where the Cubs were the local favorites. I didn't know of any 10-minute ride on Earth that might give you more glimpses of life. Flowered curtains flapping in pink and blue bedrooms, ironing boards on struts and yellow-walled kitchens, gray-haired women in printed blouses and children in gray sweatshirts resting their heads on their folded hands along window sills, men in stain-stiff blue coveralls working over engines, red Chinese characters flickering in lighted signs, white-capped mugs of beer with cool blue mottos, "From the land of sky-blue waters." Can you say, "From the land of sky-blue water," brewed in God's country. Greek Orthodox crosses, stars of David, crucifixes, red, orange, and silver-white neon letters blaring, Red Hots, wire transfers, podiatrist, palm reader, tacos, 24-hour, Teamsters, optometrist, pizza, ward committeeman, charred Polish, happy hour, checks cashed, bagels, barbecue, lottery tickets, doses, barbacoa, wash, dry, fold, always open, and Christ died for our sins. At a time when so many teams were moving into nameless new exurbs and abandoned downtown lots, the Cubs were still the hometown team of a neighborhood that, as far as we could see, held the whole world in a few city blocks. There were better baseball teams for sure, but no better team to root for in no better place than the Cubs. As Brad noted, I had a couple of particularly personal relations that I was blessed to have in my life, and I must say with the team. My godfather, my father's best friend, the man I got to call Uncle Jack, was the longtime announcer of the Chicago Cubs. And I do not get a chance to do this on NPR, so let me try. That's it. Back, hey, hey! All the way out on Waveland Avenue! Thank you. That's not bad, is it? That's not bad. Well, I've certainly spent many years rehearsing it. But Al, when we played baseball, that's the voice we heard that kind of narrated our own games, right? I mean, that's it. Liechtenstein hits the ball. I can't look back. That's what you tell yourself as a unfortunate kid trying to imitate your elders, the greatest baseball players, even on the Cubs at that point, like Billy Williams and Ernie Banks. And Uncle Jack was an absolutely wonderful guy. By the way, a number of years ago, I was told by a woman in New York that, where are our children? All right, okay. They don't know what I'm talking about, I hope. Anyway, I was told that you could tell a man was from the north side of Chicago and they were of a certain vintage if in their moment of highest romantic fruition, they shouted, hey, hey. And I told this to Uncle Jack, and he thought it was the best possible ratification of his life's work that he could ever have. And to the day he left us, he would lean over, we'd hug and kiss each other goodbye, and he'd say, you keep saying hey, hey now, kid. You keep saying hey, hey. And my Auntie Marion's second husband, and I believe his third wife, second husband, and his third wife was my Auntie Marion, was Charlie Grimm, who was the manager of the Chicago Cubs in 1945 when they were last in the World Series. They met because my Auntie Marion was a lounge singer, and Charlie was really a very good left-handed banjo player. And in those days, players didn't earn $15 million a season, and when Charlie retired, he was kind of a roving goodwill ambassador for the Cubs, but he also earned a living in nightclubs playing the banjo and singing and telling stories about being Charlie Grimm. And he is probably best remembered as the face that's front and center in the Rockwell portrait called The Dugout. It was the, I believe, September 4th, 1948 cover of the Saturday Evening Post, and Uncle Charlie is massive. He had enormous hands. And because he's a former first baseman and a banjo player for that matter, he knew that people would stare at his hands. So he was the first man that I knew who got manicures, something is still on my mind because he knew people would stare at his hands. And he used to hold his enormous leathery hands out and say, oh, these weren't made for carrying a briefcase, just a baseball glove and an old-fashioned glass. And so one of his enormous hands was against, and he was in deep pain and distress and chagrin by whatever was going on the field. And the genius in Rockwell's depiction, of course, is you don't know what imbecilic play has just transpired, which has embarrassed Charlie Grimm and embarrassed the entire Cub bench. Just, it's enough to even make the bat boy wince in chagrin to see his heroes misbehaving like that. So Uncle Charlie didn't care for that picture because he thought it made him look like a basset hound. And he was actually a very dapper guy who carried himself very well. But I think he got a little bit soft on the painting as time went on because he understood that he was not going to go into the Hall of Fame, but that Rockwell painting made him a part of history. So I had personal relations that way with the club, which obviously are reflected in the book. And those two guys were particularly important to me because a lot of people here know my father died when I was 16. And these are both men who, in their own way, tried to step in and tried to be a bit of a father figure for me. I would sometimes get off impulsively as the L would pull into the Addison Street station, because we would get out of Senate like 3:15, and sometimes we had after-school activities of one distinction or another, and sometimes the W or L flag would be up. Who are we kidding? Usually the L flag. That would mean the club had lost, and I would impulsively just get off, and I would go in and I would tell the Andy Frain usher downstairs that I wanted to see Uncle Jack, and I would come up to the Pink Poodle, which was the lounge that they had at Wrigley Field, and Uncle Jack had a circle of people that he would entertain. And it was with sometimes, lots of typically Cub players and coaches, sports writers from out of town. And it was, I think I got a sense of what it was to try and be a man by watching the way my Uncle Jack was such a gentleman, and the way Uncle Jack picked up the check, or at least always offered to. And one of the things that he really disliked about Leo DeRocher was that he said Leo DeRocher never picked up the check. That was the lowest circle in hell as far as my Uncle Jack was concerned. I do, as you have to with the Cubs, I do write about curses. I wind up saying that, of course, I don't believe in curses. Curses are superstitions that feed on the feeble and the vulnerable, which made us Cub fans particularly vulnerable. And of course, there's no such thing as curses. I go back, for example, and try and take the Stephen Bartman incident apart frame by frame, and I regret that it's called the Stephen Bartman incident, because it shouldn't be really. I also don't want to call it the Moises Alou incident. I don't think he did anything wrong. Perhaps I need to explain that. It was a number of years ago at this point, but Stephen Bartman was the fan. In fact, may I read something? This is another one of my kind of minor league poetic efforts that I have in here. Let me see what I have. Forgive me. Bella Sandberg, anti-Yanks. Here we go. Kipling. Think Kipling for the moment. For some reason, when I read this, I have to do an accent. I'm sorry. You may talk of hot dogs and beer when the score of the game is drear, and you're wondering why the Cubs cannot win the series. But of all the Cubby fans we knew, the name that brings most ballyhoo is the guy who became a goat, Stephen Bartman. It's still Bartman, 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 that goofus in the headphones, Stephen Bartman. He was a great guy. He was actually a Little League coach and a devoted fan, and must say he was dressed a lot like you that night, sir. And he had the hat on and his headphones, and fly ball came over into the third base side, and instinctively, reflexively, he reached for it. Moises Alou, the Cubs left fielder, reached up to try and catch the ball. Now, Moises Alou was a all-star outfielder. Moises Alou said he could have caught that ball. I don't know, but I can't discount what Moises Alou said. That being said, Stephen Bartman didn't break into the line of play by reaching for it with the glove. And as people have pointed out, that's when the Miami Marlins really began to hit, and that's when they scored runs, and the Cubs couldn't get the final 5 outs, and they lost the game that followed thereafter. So I don't think it's in any way fair to hold Stephen Bartman responsible for what happened that night at all. I do think, to give away what I write in the book, that we Cub fans were responsible for it. If you take a look at the video over and over, and forgive me for making this tasteless joke, I have seen that video frame by frame more than I have the Zapruder film. And, yeah, I know. And in any event, I think as you see it, what happened is that Moises Alou slammed down his glove, and he became demonstrably upset. Had he just walked back to his position in left field and gotten on with the game, I think it's possible that the Cubs would have continued what, after all, had been good play in the game that far, and might have prevailed, gotten the 5 outs that they needed, and actually gotten into the World Series that year in 2003. Instead, what happened, he slammed down his glove, he became openly annoyed, he began to yell at the umpire, he appealed for some kind of fan interference. That appeal was made to the umpires. Play stopped. And in the interim, the fans at Wrigley Field, which is to say people like us, although my wife and I were not at Wrigley Field that night, if you recall, fans like us, began to chant asshole, asshole, and see very ugly things, and people even threw some beers and slices of pizza. I think that set off a panic reaction in the minds of players. And you talk to players over the years, you would talk to the Cubs about, is there such thing as a curse? They would say, no, of course there's no such thing as a curse. And then they would say, look, I was always the best athlete in my town, or I was always the best athlete in my high school. I have won state championships. I've been scouted since I was 12 years old. I don't know anything about curses. And then they would get to the Cubs, and people would say, oh, you're going to love it. You're never a star the way you are on the north side of Chicago. Absolutely great ballpark. You're going to have a wonderful time. But there is this curse, And I think what happened that night is that Moises Alou and then the fans set off a panic reaction among the players on the field. And they became demonstrative. They got noticeably tight in their play thereafter. So I think it was we fans that have to accept responsibility for maybe finessing or not so finessing the Cubs out of the World Series that year. There was, I hesitate to use a word like curse, but there was a real life tragedy that I think is often overlooked in the saga of the Cubs, and that's the death of a young man named Kenny Hubbs. He was arguably the best second baseman in the National League. He had been Rookie of the Year. He had, I forget how many chances he had fielded consecutively without any kind of error. And he had a brilliant future ahead of him. And he was also a wonderful young man. He was the kind of player who would visit children's hospitals, who would come early to the park to sign autographs. He was from a fine family. He was a student at Brigham Young during the off season. And the Cubs were looking forward to a future where this fine young man, Kenny Hubbs, would be at second. Ernie Banks, their most valuable player, future Hall of Famer, would be at shortstop. Ron Santo, great all-star third baseman, would be at third. Billy Williams would be in right field and the outfield. And the very good pitchers like Kenny Holtzman and Fergie Jenkins. Perhaps some of you know the story. After winning the Golden Glove and after being Rookie of the Year, Kenny Hubbs went back to being a student in the off-season at Brigham Young, with the bonus that Mr. Wrigley settled on him for being Rookie of the Year. He bought a Cessna, and unfortunately he died in a plane crash with a friend of his at the age of 24. And I think this absolutely took the heart out of the Cubs as they were developing. And they were also, because of that, I think, tempted into making what's often considered to be, they felt they needed to recover some star power in the lineup. And they made what is often considered to be the worst trade in baseball history, which is Lou Brock for Ernie Broglio. Ernie Broglio was a pretty good St. Louis Cardinals pitcher. Lou Brock was a not terrific at that point outfielder for the Chicago Cubs, who would go on to become a Hall of Famer, and perhaps certainly the best base stealer of his time. He blossomed when he left the Cubs. Let me put it that way. And Ernie Broglio was out of organized baseball within a couple of years. The Brock for Broglio trade is considered to be the quintessential bad trade that was made by the Cubs, I think trying to recover some star power. So all of that was set into effect. I think one of the things that has baffled people about the Cubs over the years, and I will say this with Red Sox fans here because they benefited from the same thing, people couldn't understand why people kept coming to the games. I mean, why would they come to see people lose time after time after time? And this used to particularly, I must say, exasperate the White Sox on the South Side because, they would have good teams. They would have good players, and yet the Cubs perpetually would outdraw them. And like the Red Sox, I think, for many years, there was a kind of reverse appeal that began to set in. Now, part of it was the loveliness of the park, which you could tell, particularly beginning in the 1960s, the 1970s, Uncle Jack, who often did the ads for the club, he wouldn't even bother to mention the people who were on the team. He would say there was a baseball game, but he would say, come on out to beautiful Wrigley Field, sit in the sun, have some beer. They didn't even really emphasize the fact that a baseball game would occur there. and they would get 3 million people into the park. And all of their years of playing, you can't really classically refer to it as failure, because from a business point of view, they were one of the most successful franchises in baseball history. They lost game after game, year after year, didn't win a World Series for 108 years, and they were year after year just behind the Yankees and the Dodgers and occasionally the Red Sox as the most commercially successful franchise in Major League Baseball. As Michael Lewis said, why in the hell would they want to win? That just costs more money in the long run, as we just saw. You know, Mr. Ricketts had to get everybody on the team and some of the old stars these enormous honking rings with 108 diamonds in them, and, you know, has to give everybody an increase. When you lose year after year, you don't have to do that. So, in any event, that was always, I think, they managed to make losing part of their appeal. But I think more to the point, in many ways, as baseball developed, like a lot of modern sports, the Cubs became, along with the Red Sox for many years, the Cubs became the anti-Yankees. There was a feeling that big-time sports had gotten insupportable, was caring about the wrong things, was awash perhaps in too much money, and was moving into these soulless excerpts. Let me read a section of that if I could. And then this section is going to turn into something what also made the Cubs a national icon of losing, if I might refer to it that way, was the fact that their games were on nationally every day. They were on WGN cable, superstation called, across the country. And I think they began to become part of a community of people who would watch in the middle of the day. Alas, a lot of people like my father, who, as a lot of people here know, had a drinking problem. And in this country, really in many ways, in the world in many places over the years, I've gone into a tavern at one point in the middle of the day to get directions when we're on assignment looking for something, or to use the bathroom, or before there were cell phones, to use the telephone. And you would see the Cubs game on overhead. People sitting there watching 2 and 3 stools from each other. Let me read this section. It was also during these years that the Cubs began to become a national baseball brand. The Yankees and Dodgers won. The Cubs usually, often comically, lost. But the Cubs became the anti-Yanks. While the Yankees and Dodgers were corporate flagships among baseball teams, the Cubs were part of a candy store, or at least the Wrigley Chewing Gum Company. You began with the park, beautiful Wrigley Field, as Uncle Jack pronounced it, at the beginning of each game. Wrigley and Boston's Fenway Park were among the last of the neighborhood ball yards. Wrigley was built of red brick like the walls of an old fire or police station, or 1,000 apartment blocks on the north side. Inside, the brick in the outfield was garbed in bright green ivy. The park's pocket-sized dimensions and close seats could make Wrigley Field feel as friendly as a children's sandbox. Home runs, alas, usually from the other teams, could smash through apartment windows across the street, just like a home run hit by a 10-year-old playing in a parking lot. "Excuse me, Mr. Aaron, who's going to pay for that window?" As a lot of modern baseball began to rile fans with colossal salaries, cold, soulless stadiums, and owners who uprooted franchises for tax breaks, the Cubs were a team with a sense of place. That club in their park, across from the fire station, on the north side of Chicago, seemed to many exactly what a national pastime ought to be. The Cubs promoted a day at the park as family entertainment, but over the years, with their daytime games beamed across the country, and even around the world, on cable and satellite, I also began to see Cubs games as a pastime that linked solitary souls on a lonely afternoon. This section's going to be a little hard for me, but I think of my father, and sometimes it's almost too painful to think of him, awake and exhausted at 2 p.m. in our small, faded hotel room, the Cubs playing on as one more drink dwindled down at his elbow. Many times in many places I've wandered into a dark bar on a sunny day to ask for directions or to use the bathroom, and seen a scattering of strangers roosting 2 or 3 seats apart from one another, watching the game from Wrigley Field on the screen overhead. The voice of Jack Brickhouse, Harry Carey, or Len Casper keeping them company. I also, and I think this is, look, I know there are a lot of Cubs books out there. I didn't begin to write mine until they had won. I won't tell you the whole story. We'd had feelings over the years, but nothing in place until they actually won. I never would have begun to write a book about the Cubs until they had won the World Series, because then if they didn't, it would be my fault that I had begun to write the book. I'm glad to see you understand that. But because I'm a Chicagoan and a loyal Chicagoan, it seemed wrong to me to write a book about 2016 and the Chicago Cubs winning the World Series without mentioning the appalling and tragic homicide rate in Chicago. The Cubs are on the north side. Overwhelmingly, the homicides that have occurred have usually been on the south and the west side. But I think it's wrong to try and dismiss it with that kind of distinction. That's our city. As my wife will tell you, I get emotional about this. Those are our brothers and our sisters, and our sons and our daughters, and our mothers and our fathers. There were 42 people shot in Chicago last weekend. And I don't pretend to have an answer to it, and I know the answer isn't easy, and it's not a bromide. But I didn't want to write a book that didn't see that 2016 was also a year that had this appalling huge number of homicides. It's a disgrace to the city. Chicago is the city where they invented the skyscraper. Chicago is the city where they split the atom. Chicago is the city where they invented improvisational comedy. There is genius and ingenuity and wealth in that city. And the wonderful occasion of welcoming home the Cubs, there's 5 or 6 million people turned out on the streets of Chicago, the largest human gathering in American history until the Trump inauguration just a few days later. I had to do that, I'm sorry. Yeah, all right. Someday, if Chicago's able to get a handle on that, not just Chicago, that would be a parade worth having. I more or less, well, I end the book in the 7th game, but let me just mention going to the White House, because this is one of the great occasions of my life. The Cubs were invited to the White House by President Obama. I must say, in this overly politicized atmosphere and city, I assumed it was because Donald Trump had made a couple of, I think, infelicious tweets about the Ricketts family during the campaign. The Ricketts family, one of the controlling partners, the brother Todd Ricketts, almost came to work for the administration. They couldn't work something out. But the Ricketts family has been a generous contributor to conservative and Republican causes. One son, Tom Ricketts' brother, is of course the governor of Nebraska. And a sister, however, is very much on the other side politically. She's a member of the Chicago Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame. She likes to joke she's the first member of the Ricketts family to get into the Hall of Fame. And so at one point during the campaign, Donald Trump, I guess the Ricketts family had tried to fund the very brief anyone but Trump movement. And Donald Trump had let loose a tweet early in the morning or late at night or in the precipice of the two in the middle of the night that said something like, if the Ricketts family isn't careful, I'm going to talk about what a lousy job they've been doing with the Chicago Cubs. Any other year in 108, that tweet would have been cogent, lucid, and accurate. 2016, it was fake news. So I assumed that the Cubs were coming to the White House under President Obama because Mr. Ricketts had been a little bit affronted. As Mr. Ricketts said to me, he said, I didn't, when he said the Ricketts family, Tom Ricketts, he said I didn't like Donald Trump criticizing my mother and father. The real answer turns out to be, as I found out, not political at all. President Obama called up Joe Madden, the manager, and he said, look, I'm a White Sox fan, and one of the things I admire about President Obama is he didn't try to pretend to be a Cubs fan. You run into a lot of that. He said, look, I'm happy for the Cubs, but I'm a White Sox fan. I'll always be a White Sox fan. He said, but a lot of the people who work here in the White House, who worked for me the longest, are Northsiders. They are Cub fans, and it would give me great pleasure to be able to give your visit to the White House as them to a gift. as they end a hard 8 years by my side. And I thought that was just wonderful. And it was a wonderful occasion. I dressed up to go there. I was about to leave, and I had on my Chicago Cubs scarf. And my wife said, "Darlene, do not go to the White House dressed like a doofus." I get through security. The first person I recognize as I walk in there is Senator Durbin of Illinois, who's wearing a Cubs scarf. As my wife pointed out, Dick Durbin can look like a doofus, and it was he made it seem handsome. It was a wonderful fashion, and it was a wonderful occasion. It was wonderful to see people like Senator Durbin and the Attorney General Lisa Madigan, and Mayor Emanuel, who was not known to smile a lot. God bless him. Just turned into 9-year-old kids again, as they were seeing, Rizzo and Bryant and old stars like Fergie Jenkins and Jose Cardinal. It was just wonderful. And they'd brought their children and their grandchildren. It was just wonderful. And President Obama gave a wonderful set of remarks. And he said towards the end, he said, look, he began by saying, it gives me great pleasure, even as a White Sox fan, to be able to say something that none of my predecessors have been able to say. Welcome to the White House, World Series champion Chicago Cubs. And then he said, look, a lot of people wonder why we care about sports. And he said, well, because it's a common language. It's a way we have of relating to each other. It's an experience that we share. And he said, it is not lost on me that one of the reasons the American people were able to accept me as President of the United States is the contribution that Jackie Robinson made to this country, and that Ernie Banks made on the north side of Chicago. And he said, so it's a common language we share, it's a love and an enthusiasm that we share. And I think it's one of those experiences that reminds us we share so much more than that which divides us. And I got back into the White House offices with the president's chief speechwriter, and I said, I think that's the most eloquent presidential address since Gettysburg. And I'm not even sure it's not better than Gettysburg. And he pointed the transcript and he said, that was all POTUS, as they called him. That was something that President Obama had ad-libbed on the spot. I want to invite your questions. We want to leave time for signing books. I know Mother's Day is coming up. Father's Day is coming up. There are always odd and obscure religious holidays, which I'm anxious to assist. I can write inscriptions on the book in Hebrew, and we have 2 daughters at a parochial school that can help me with the Latin. We can figure this out, all right? I just want to say, and I understand how this gets passed along in the press material, but I think we have to be rid of that phrase, long-suffering Cub fans, and not just because the Cubs finally won a World Series after 108 years. I've been a Cubs fan all of my life, and I guarantee you there have been moments I've cried. It is like a love story. My wife found me after the Stephen Bartman case, found me in the bathroom the next morning sobbing on the bathroom floor. I really thought they had a chance. Suddenly wondering, why have I married this man? And like a love story, there are times when you get filled up and you say, I've had it. And then a few minutes later, I'm sorry, honey, I didn't mean it. Long suffering, no. I have had a wonderful time all of my life as a Cubs fan. I've loved feeling this sense of fun that we have with each other. I've loved being at Wrigley Field. I've loved watching the games. I've loved being a part of this extraordinary community of people who care and feel and are united in this shared appreciation. So suffering, never. So thank you very much. Yes, sir. You have a question, sir?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you very much for your words today. I'm very much enjoying reading. I'm very much enjoying reading the book. My question is, what would you say are some of the most important ways in which your childhood experiences as a Chicago Cubs fan impacted your career choice in journalism?
Oh, I
And
hadn't
on
thought
NPR.
about that. I don't know what. I guess it made me want to be a war correspondent or something. Or I covered the Chicago City Council. You know, I have never thought about that, and I wouldn't want to give you a facile answer. I don't know. I was at an awards banquet yesterday in Chicago, and our old friend and one of our godmothers, Jackie Leiden, is here tonight, and she and I are Chicago reporters who've been blessed to go around the world and cover politics and conflict and all kinds of things. And I think she would agree with me in saying covering Chicago prepares you to cover the world. Because there is the world reflected there. As our friend Rick Bayless says, there is somewhere in Chicago, no matter where you're from in the world, you go to Chicago and there is somewhere in that city where there's a block where they speak your native language and serve your native foods. So I think maybe that had something to do with it. And the north side of Chicago was just a wonderfully diverse place. Oh, yes,
Over
sir.
here.
Sorry.
Okay, hi. So thank you for your really great presentation. You have a career in stand-up comedy if you ever want to change fields. It was wonderful to listen to your stories. And your voice, I feel like your voice has been part of our family for many years, and thank you for that. So my two quick questions. One is there a small part of you that wished they hadn't won to hold on to that unique feeling? And the other is, could you briefly discuss your career, how you started?
Yeah. No, there is no part of me that wishes that they hadn't won. You know, I have been asked a lot since, this was November 2nd, which was our daughter's 10th birthday, and a few days before the election. So I have been asked the inevitable question, would you trade the Cubs World Series victory for the result in the election? And, firstly, I have, as a journalist, no official position, but it reminds me, the old Jack Benny joke, man comes up to him on the street and says, your money or your life? And there's a long silence. Your money or your life? And Jack Benny says, I'm thinking. That's how I feel about the, I'm thinking. I'm trying to, no, I think, I've heard this said by people, the Cubs won't be as special anymore. I don't think that's true. I don't think one World Series victory wipes out that history. It certainly doesn't in any way subsume the neighborhood and the relationship between the club and the fans. So, no, not like that. There's no, no particular story. I worked for Channel 11 in Chicago, and that show went out of business. And in any event, I began to freelance pieces to NPR, and I was hired and eventually into their Chicago bureau. Same kind of story you have, Jackie Leiden. No.
Thank you.
Good. Yes, sir.
Belmont and Broadway and Lakeview High School.
Oh,
Some of the same
all right,
experiences.
Al, what did we think of the people at Lakeview? Yeah.
My
Yeah.
compliments.
Right, yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right. Yeah, sorry.
My
Go ahead.
compliments to you for raising the homicide issue. Nelson Mandela used sports as an element
Yes.
of reconciliation. Any suggestions on how this evolving positive Cubs aura and presence might cross town and bring people more closely together?
Oh, that would be one of those things that's a stretch. It's interesting. At the White House, President Obama told us that, and I guess I'd known this, that Michelle Obama is actually a Cubs fan. And that Michelle Obama grew up as a Cubs fan because she would, her father was a city worker who would begin work early. At one point he was injured, and she would get home after school, 3:15 or 4 o'clock, and the Cubs game would be on. And so there are Cubs fans on the South Side, just as there are, for that matter, White Sox fans on the North Side. Although there were until last year. Let's put it that way. I don't know. I wouldn't begin to prescribe anything like that, but I think as President Obama suggested, you begin with a feeling and a recognition that there are certain delights and joys in this world which we can share. This is another franchise entire. I love the job, by the way, the Ricketts family has done with the team. Not just. In addition to winning the World Series, I like the way they have recognized the old stars like Fergie Jenkins and Jose Cardinal, who never had a chance to get to the World Series, but they gave them World Series rings that make them a part of all public recognitions. I admire the way they've been active in the community. I think they've absolutely been terrific. I think it's a good example of what a family can do. And it's interesting because Tom Ricketts said to me, he said, people are fascinated by the political differences that we have in our family because, we have some people who are very conservative. Then I have a sister who's been outspoken proponent and advocate in behalf of gay rights and same-sex marriage. And he said, you have me, the guy who runs the baseball club in the middle. And he said, I just think we're a family. And, we get together and we kid each other about our differences and we have some fun with it. But in the end, we're a family. We share so much more than that which divides us. So I hope maybe there's some kind of key in that.
No, thank you. You're a real gentleman.
Thank you. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I just wanted to say that my late mother-in-law, would just wait for your show at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. I mean, it was just the hit of her week. And she's no longer with me, but she would say to me that your show, with your interview at 9 o'clock with the one of the Morrow boys, who I forget his name now.
Dan Shore.
Dan Shore. Was
Lee
just
Shore is with us tonight, just
my
feet from
God.
where you are.
That was a highlight of my mother-in-law.
Well,
I
me
wanted
too.
to say, as a Red Sox fan for
Yeah.
many years and suffered through their many sources, that there is one person who is really responsible for both teams, Theo Epstein. And I would like your opinion of his future, whether in baseball or maybe in politics.
I wonder if it's possible for him to marry both of our daughters, too. I'm thinking aloud. No, he's happily married and has a family. I don't know. I don't think I had occasion to exchange some words with him just yesterday. I will explain, by the way, that when we met Theo Epstein a few years ago, adding to the list of stupid things that my wife can tell you that I've said, I said to Theo Epstein, if you can get the Cubs into the World Series, you will go down in history as the greatest Chicagoan of all time. And then I noticed we were standing feet from David Axelrod. And I said, well, with one exception, of course. And God bless David, he said, oh, no, I think the president would agree with you. He said to me yesterday that he just signed a 5-year contract extension, and he said I don't just intend to fulfill it, I look forward to fulfilling it. That's what I want to do. I love this city. I love being here. I love the Ricketts family. I think when that's done for one reason or another, I don't think there's much left for him in baseball. He's won the World Series with the Cubs and the Red Sox. Winning a World Series for Tampa Bay, not the same thing at all. Or, for that matter, winning the 30th World Series for the Yankees, not that thing at all. I think he goes on to something else. He does have political feelings. He was an outspoken supporter of Hillary Rodham Clinton, helped to raise some money. So I guess that's possible, but I don't think he will lack for opportunities. I mean, the first thing I think he's going to do is write a memoir, the advance for which will probably dwarf, or the advance for which will probably, absolutely overwhelm the advance that Michelle and Barack Obama received for their memoirs. So he doesn't have to worry about his future. I'd be interested to know that too. Yes, sir.
Two-part question, quickie.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what your Game 7th experience was like? Mine was spent half on the floor. Okay, that's part A. And part B, what would Royko's Game 7 column, what would the lead be on Royko's Game 7 column?
Oh, that's a good question. Mike Royko was the great Chicago columnist. Wake me up when it's over, or something like that, he might say. I had gone to the 3 games in Chicago, and I had some feelers from friends in Cleveland about going to the games there, but I had to get back to what I do, to my life. And we were in the middle of an election, too, you might recall, so I couldn't be off watching World Series games all the time. So I said no to Cleveland. I came back here, and parenthetically, the 3 games in Chicago, they lost the first 2. And I'm on my way to the 3rd game, and I called my wife, and I said, darling, am I an idiot to go to this game? The Cubs have lost every World Series game I've ever been to. I can sell our ticket to one of these deeply unscrupulous men on the street. They were offering $2,000 for a ticket, and we can be that much up on the tuition for Stanford, which we try and set aside for our daughters, of course, in full expectation. And And then it was my wife who pointed out that if I didn't go to the game and they lost, I would blame myself for not being there. If I didn't go to the game and they won, I would never again be able to go to a Chicago Cubs game or watch one. So I went, and thankfully they won that third game. Seventh game here, we were at home. Was I cool and composed? I don't mean to put you on the spot, darling. All right. Yeah, of course not. No. Our daughters were up. We sent them to bed during there was the 17-minute rain delay. But for a couple of reasons. For one thing, they showed the weather monitor and the weather channel, and there seemed to be a big patch of blue that was rain. So you didn't know if that rain delay was going to be 10 minutes or 2 hours. And our in case somebody else is here from Our Lady of Victory tonight, our daughters had school the next day, and we wanted them to be, ready for it. Also, things did not look good then. And I did not want my daughters watching when the Cubs lost, because then I thought they would grow up with the same kind of mentality that I had. The same kind of mentality. Every time a daughter came into our life, I would go out or order online these little onesies that you can put on your baby that say Chicago Cubs. And we would get, we would come home from China with our children, and magically I wouldn't be able to find them. Turns out my wife had kept them out of sight because she didn't want our children clad in the livery of losers like that. Or at least not the Cubs. And so I didn't want our daughters to see that. I didn't. I wanted them to, every father wants a better life for their child, right? That's what I wanted. And then, of course, they came back after what we now know as Jason Hayward's magnificent oration in the locker room, where he said, "We're the best team in baseball. We're not going to be beaten now." This guy, it was wonderful. That is above Gettysburg in comparison to President Obama. And they came out and won the game, and I sobbed and I cried and I couldn't believe it, and I pinched myself, and I watched every drip of champagne come off of Rizzo's torso in the locker room celebrations, and finally went to bed. And but I thought, because we had promised to keep our daughters appraised of what happened, so I came in to our older daughter's bedroom. She's just turned 14, and to show you the generational difference, I woke her up and I said, "Baby, the Cubs won. The Cubs won the World Series." And Elise just turned over and said, "I knew they would." And that's so different because, of course, I didn't. I felt, on the contrary, they would probably... And look, imagine what the reputation of the Cubs would be, the legacy of the Cubs, if they had won 103 games, the best record in Major League Baseball, came back from a 3-1 game deficit, and then lost the 7th game of the World Series at the last minute. So, in any event, thankfully it developed another way. But we should remind ourselves in life the edge between that kind of exultation and victory and abject defeat of a kind no other baseball team had ever experienced was just that slender. Sorry, forgive me. Yes. 2 more? Yes.
Scott, in the 108 years that the Cubs waited for the victory, there were several, I won't say many, but several times they teased us that they might actually break through. One of those was 1969, when we were seniors at Senn, and they were...
You were there too?
Yes, sir.
Oh, you were a senior. Al and I were a little younger, but yeah.
No. In the fall of 69.
Oh, 69, yes,
fall
okay.
of 69.
Did we senior then? 70, yeah, okay. Yeah, right, yeah.
And
what's your name, sir?
Dave Lockwood.
Dave! How are you? And you're like a minister now or something, right?
No, my father was a minister, and my
Oh,
brother.
you're the Reverend Lockwood, right?
It's his son. I'm a preacher's kid. But is 2016 make up for 1969?
Sure. Firstly, they had nothing to make up, to us. We had a wonderful time in 1969, despite the fact that they lost. We had a wonderful time. A couple of rough days, but it was a wonderful summer, wasn't it? Until things began to go south.
Yeah, but I moved from Chicago to New York, and they think 69 was a good year.
I understand. There is that separation of opinion. No, I've run into that. And by the way, as you will notice, Mets fans become very sensitive about the fact, because we portray it as the Cubs losing the pennant, and of course, silly gooses. They think that the Mets won the pennant. It's not the same thing at all. I will add that, there's been lots of dissect. Yes, of course it makes up for it. And that was, until this year, that was the greatest Chicago Cubs team of all time, and they won nothing. But, take a look at all the Hall of Famers that are on it.
Yeah, thank you.
Scotty.
Jackie Lynn. Yeah.
I don't have an actual question, so I wanted to make sure I went last.
Uh-oh.
But and I haven't read the book yet. Can't wait. But I wanted to share a couple.
You can wait.
A couple of Chicago Bureau memories that I thought people here.
I'm sorry.
Regarding the Cubs.
Are we out of time?
All night. We got to get these people.
I'm really sorry about. Thanks you all very much, Jackie.
But
I'm sorry.
here is a real story.
Yeah.
Scott always did anything to do with the games and the players. I live near Wrigley Field, but he and our producer, Jonathan Smokey Bear, I was fortunate enough to learn more about the game with these guys because we could hear the organ music from my apartment. And I did a story on the scoreboard. One of our friends wrote a play called The Bleacher Bums, one of the other Chicago Bureau, the husband of Ina Jaffe.
Right, the Organic Theater in Chicago. It's
but
a
here's
great
what I
play.
wanted to comment on.
Yeah.
We would take the phone off the hook and go to the games in
That's
the
true.
afternoon.
That's true.
If we felt like it or it was a good enough game. Now I'm not saying this happened all the time.
Yeah,
But
it happened.
happened.
Yeah.
And what do you think?
Well, it's a
would be
big
the
town. We
fate-
were out covering the news. What do you mean?
Can you imagine the fate of some young NPR wannabe reporter today saying, "Oh, you couldn't reach me. I was at the game. I turned off my cell phone."
Yeah.
Anyway, this is a real treasure. So Scott actually did take the phone off the hook to
I
go
did.
to the baseball games.
Yeah.
Long before the World Series coronation was a twinkling in anyone's eye. So anyway.
Research, right. Research, as a matter of fact. Thank you very much. If anyone... Oh, yes, go ahead, please, ma'am.
So I'm one of those people who's here for a Mother's Day gift. And my mom loves to talk about the chemistry of this team from last year.
Oh,
and
it's great.
And so I just wanted to hear your reflections as such a long Cubs fan of how it relates to some of the other
I think
great
my,
games.
my, and not just my wife's, but my wife's, and the favorite moment of a lot of people in that seventh game was Rizzo and David Ross, the catcher. And I'm not a big fan of that art form where Fox Sports puts microphones on players because they're aware of the fact that people are listening to them, and it's usually kind of, oh, well, yeah, that fastball's really working, huh? Yeah, sure is. We got to be... But this, God bless him, Tony Rizzo was, he said, "I'm in a glass case of emotion right now," which I find out later really is a line from Anchorman, Will Ferrell's film. And David Ross says, "Well, you just got to breathe, buddy. You just got to live with it. It's going to even get worse when we get into the ninth." And it was just wonderful. Reminds you how, they're kids and how the excitement was not. I mean, imagine the excitement of winning after 108 years. I can't imagine how you contain that emotion. John Lester and Anthony Rizzo are both survivors of cancer, and there's that cord between them. And I was in Chicago yesterday. Just yesterday it was announced the two of them together have given $8 million to the Lurie Cancer Center at Northwestern University. Now, they can afford it, yes, but as I think we saw, without getting too weepy about it, when they went into the locker room during that rain delay, it was. As Joe Madden said, it was character that they called on. All the data had been done. All the planning had been done. What they had to do was come through. They had to dig down, and that's what they did. It's a wonderfully balanced team that way. And Theo Epstein said he was looking for people who had character, and I think he found them. Yeah, 60 Minutes just did that's that other show on CBS, isn't it, if I'm not mistaken? When I said to Rand Morrison, the producer of CBS Sunday Morning, he said, he sent me a nice note where he said, an email, he said, "Okay, to answer your question, do we need another damn piece about the Cubs? No. If you can figure out another angle, yes." Yeah. So that's what I was able to do. So thank you very, very much. Very good.